All right. Welcome back to another episode of the Metacast. I am your host, Meta Prime. And today I'm going to be talking about my article on the necessity of rebuilding social structure. And what I want to do is just kind of go through it top to bottom. It's a very distilled encapsulation of how I think about the current problem that we're in with kind of the falling apart of social structure and the replacement of that social structure with economic alternative systems. And we'll get into that. What do I mean by that specifically a little bit later? But it also talks extensively about how we can rebuild things. And if you're familiar with my content, if you've been following me for any amount of time, you know that a big part of what I focus on is practical solutions, specifically parallel movement. So creating alternative systems that allow us to be less dependent on kind of the corrupt mainstream systems and building things on a much more healthy foundation. And that concept broadly sounds really nice, but the question becomes, why? What is the value? What is the superiority? Is there a superiority to this alternative way of doing things? And so I've talked about this in past articles, like my Refuting Techno-Transhumanism article, where I talk about the superiority of natural process over synthetic process. And I think that same concept applies really well to the superiority of natural, healthy, normal social structure over these, again, economic alternatives. And I'll get into more examples of that. But you can think about things like daycare or babysitting or hospice care or therapy, right? All of these are systems that we have in the modern world that replace how old social structure used to take care of things like, when the older generation was starting to need assistance, and it was a lot easier for them to move in with the younger generation, or have the younger generation take care of them. And the fact that we have hospice care, right, that covers that need. But there's a lot of other things. So for example, like the incentivization structure that exists, that have disappeared with moving that over to an economic alternative. And I would argue that a lot of the problems that we're seeing in the world today are kind of downstream of this broken down social structure, this lack of connection that we have. Before we get into the article itself, I thought it might be a little bit fun also to just kind of show you a little bit of my writing process. So for those of you who are watching, you can see this very easily. For those of you who are just listening in on the podcast, basically I use Google Docs for all of my stuff. I know that's kind of funny to be kind of a counterculture person and to kind of use these mainstream systems. But hey, I mean, they're staples because they work. But one of the things I'll do is I'll start kind of grappling with an idea, and to me, refining it, really distilling it down into its core parts. I did a article not so long ago about how the catch-22 of wisdom, and how it's really difficult sometimes to convey wisdom effectively, because if you do it effectively, it seems obvious. It's a really, you've effectively communicated something to someone in a way where it seems obvious, and therefore it's really hard for them to appreciate all the work that went into kind of distilling it down, refining it, and putting it in that more elegant form. And so you can see here on the left, the final draft was actually draft 10. And that's not to say that I did 10 full drafts, but I definitely went through 10 iterations. I usually start with the brainstorm. I go through a bunch of different ideas. I try to put that into an outline to make it a little bit, start to put together the structure. And then from there, I'll usually do a draft and start kind of putting that into, a more distilled out flow. And then I'll then basically throw that entire draft out and go back into an outline, and I'll keep doing that cycle until I've gotten to the final iteration where it feels like I've found the right structure. Because the previous structures, I was trying to think like, how am I going to convey all the strategies for how you rebuild social structure effectively? Do I break it down by the considerations of good strategy and, then talk about the considerations first, then the strategy, or do I, how do I group these points, all of that kind of stuff. And so I like the final iteration. I was happy with it. I mean, there's this joke among writing is like, you never think it's perfect. You're always kind of like, all right, this is good enough. And, I'm getting marginal returns past this point. So that's what we have here. So I'm just going to start from the top and I'm going to work my way down because, again, I think the article itself has a good flow to it. And I think that will, be very conducive to the podcast. But I start out making this point that we have all of these problems in the modern world, right? We have issues with corruption. Politicians are very out of touch with individuals. We have, all of these economic issues. We have issues with the boomers and their relationships to the younger generation, right? And it's very easy when you first kind of what I call break from the mainstream delusion, right? When you start to realize how bad things really are, and you start to question them, it's very easy to point the finger at things like corrupt politicians or greedy merchants, self-obsessed social activists, right? That there's all of these easily identifiable villains. But this begs the question, okay, well, how did we get to this point? How did society become so weak and so, easily pushed over that we can have all of this evil allowed to thrive? And while you can point to a lot of different things, right? Toxic tolerance and other stuff like that. Fundamentally, to me, it's a breakdown in the American social structure. We don't have the cohesion we once did. And that cohesion actually has all of these kind of less visible balancing effects, right? That healthy social structure actually creates certain incentivizations and, there's a kind of an emergent property to healthy communities that would help push back against this, right? It would keep people oriented in the right direction. It keeps them more honest, right? A very simple example of this is you have a tight-knit community and everyone kind of knows each other. Well, everyone has a reputation, and it's very important to people that, maintain a good reputation, right? Because if you drop out of favor, if you say something or you do something that's pretty despicable, people aren't going to want to work with you. And especially if your options are limited, right? You can't move to a new location. You can't, find a new job easily or something like that. You're pretty screwed if you don't have a good standing in the community. And so small communities incentivize people to behave well, behave cooperatively. One of the main problems of such a disconnected society and culture that we have today, and especially you see this online, is you can insult someone, you can be aggressive, you can be mean, you can be vitriolic, with very little actual consequence, right? You're not really building a reputation, or at least it's very hard unless you become one of the larger accounts and people start to really know who you are. You can say whatever you want and people aren't going to go after you specifically. You're just, an anonymous name in a crowd, right? Whereas again, the alternative with these more healthy systems is, you are very much who you are, and that carries with you. So a big part of what this article is trying to do, first and foremost, I kind of see it broken down into two parts. The first part is to talk about what happened with society, like how did society work? What happened, that caused these replacement of economic alternative structures. And then a few kind of other ideas like hyper capitalism, hyper individualism, and what I'm calling conscientious communitarianism, which for me is kind of it's an attempt for people, pretty obviously, to be more conscientious about building community. So I talk a little bit about that. And then the second part, I talk about strategy, because this is a big discussion that's happening a lot throughout the sphere is, okay, we realize, or a lot more people are starting to realize, hey, we need to build alternative systems. This parallel movement that I've been talking about since I first started writing in 2022, which is not a new idea, by the way. I was inspired a lot by Vladimir Zelensky's reality transurfing. He talks about pendulums. I forget exactly who coined parallel movement, but it was a counter-revolutionary idea to communism. And that was largely perpetuated initially through art. And so, for me, this is something I've thought a lot about, something I'm very passionate about. I honestly do think this is the solution, is building healthy fraternal networks online to start, and then offline is a necessary step. You need to get to know people in person. You need to build local relationships. You need to get involved in business. You need to, all of that kind of stuff is really important, because ultimately, and this kind of harkens back to a lot of my other work on this, I've talked about fraternal natalism, right? Like the idea that natalism should be the highest goal. And in order to support healthy and happy families, you need to have a healthy fraternal structure in the community. Men who, trust each other, work together, will help each other out, because that provides, the safety, the security, but also, the economic prosperity. If people are working collaboratively together, especially in high trust environments, that greases the wheels of, commerce and all of these kinds of things, right? Trade is a multiplier, right? If you have a bunch of people with different skill sets and they're all working together and they're happily trading their skill sets and working collaboratively, you're going to have a lot more productivity. And so fraternal networks are a great way to capitalize on that. You obviously need to build trust, and that's something that we'll talk about. But the point that I'm getting at here is, in order to have success, we need to build these networks. And the question becomes, okay, how can we do that? And so the second half of the article dives a lot more in depth into those questions. And again, for me, a big part of the way that I see my work is not necessarily being, prescriptive at a minute, detailed level. I try to, use kind of meta patterns, meta structure, meta strategy, right? These broad overarching concepts. And the hope there is to create a kind of language. So identifying, the key variables and, the equations of how those things relate, how they need to be balanced, right? So it maybe a mathematics is an even better way of saying it. So, what is the mathematics of rebuilding social structure? And the idea is by, identifying those variables and identifying those equations and, kind of defining those, giving those terms, putting those out there in, the intellectual vanguard that's kind of talking about these things, then we're all speaking in the same language, right? We can all check each other's math. And this hopefully will facilitate the conversation moving past what do we need to do, and kind of this grasping at straws and people trying to define all these things in different ways or giving them different terms, right? The idea here is to establish a baseline language that people can use to, and hopefully I've effectively identified all of the important points, and then we can kind of move from there. I'm sure additions are forthcoming and people will kind of have their thoughts. But all right, so to jump into the first half, we're talking about social structures and its collapse. So first and foremost, I'm a big believer in kind of the natural law side of spirituality, but also just functionality of the world that we live in, right? I think evolution and the incentivization structures and all these things are very beautifully intricate and very effective at doing what they do. So social structure can very simply be understood as this is a very effective strategy for group cooperation, right? Collaboration. And we have the shared interest of flourishing. If you've, again, heard me talk in my content, one of the things I routinely say is the goal of life is to flourish. And to define flourishing more specifically, it is the perpetuation of healthy patterns over time. And a pattern can be anything. It could be your own genetic code. It could be an idea, a philosophy. It could be a business. It could be a society. It could be a government. It could be an ethnic group of people, whatever it is. And so the idea is to say, in pursuit of flourishing, right, the highest pursuit is obviously having children. Mentioned that earlier. And not just having children, but also imbuing them with all of like the best ideas and handing off, your business, your, social connections, all of the things that have served you well, right? And the idea is that from each iteration, each generation, you're just passing on the things that work and throwing out the things that didn't. And the idea is that's how progress happens, right? Movement towards a better understanding of the reality around us, that we can work more effectively in it, using these systems, these healthy systems that we've created, trying to keep those going, maintain them, and even improve upon them, right? And so in order to do that, in order to pursue flourishing, it makes a lot of sense for individuals to collaborate, right? I mean, you have to have the family unit, right? That's the fundamental to have children, but also good, healthy communities. They'll help each other out. And this was a lot more of an immediate necessity in the past when, you survival was a little bit more difficult, and we didn't have this kind of extreme disconnect from not only like the food that we eat, but also the goods that we consume, the entertainment that we consume. You would also argue that to a large extent, people have, these online parasocial relationships. And so they are replacing, the normal social structure that they should have in their local towns with this kind of like online superficial social structure. And so, those demands were immediate. They were met, locally, and so social structure, that's how it's functioned. But it's very important to note that people did not consciously understand how social structure worked, right? Uh, you know, it's kind of like one of those things where when we think about evolution, we often mistakenly limit that understanding to physical attributes, right? Are you tall, right? Or color of your, skin, eyes, hair, all of that kind of stuff. But I would argue that there's also an extremely other important element to evolution, which is your instincts, right? Your proclivities, your kind of socialization default. And you think of this more as kind of like maybe firmware that people have, and people who were more inclined to socialize and to get along with other people and to work collaboratively were a lot more successful, right? That being said, and it's not really something I talk about in the article, but it's kind of like a fun thing to think about, is like people who take advantage of societies, right? Who are parasitic or who take advantage of others, right? You have to have an immunity to that as well. And so, you don't want to just be trusting. You want to have ways of sorting out who to trust. And so there's all of these things that kind of naturally evolved, and then people kind of fit into different positions in society. You have leaders, you have followers. That's not a bad thing. I've said this plenty of times before. People online, when they talk about counterculture, they'll think about things like, oh, there's so many people are sheep. And it's like, yeah, but that's not a bug. That's a feature, right? If you had a well-functioning society, you want a lot of people who are just going to say, hey, the leadership has our best interests in mind. They're going to lay out some rules that help us collaborate, because that's really what laws are, right? Laws aren't these immutable, unbreakable things like we think about. The law of gravity is really not something you can break. You have laws in society. The idea of laws in society is for the proper organization of society such that people can be, more successful, flourish, right? It's, guidelines for cooperation. They aren't meant to be kind of like immutable, unbreakable things, right? Ideally, the leaders care about the people and want them to be successful, and so they're passing good laws. But not to get too sidetracked, but the point that I'm making here is that society, or people, did not understand consciously how social structure did all of the things that it did, right? It was invisible, the way that it kind of, balanced stuff out. And so I talk about romantic relationships as a perfect example of this. In the modern world, we have obviously dating, and, the whole female question is a huge problem. And I think it's a fundamental mistake for people who, when they approach it solely from the viewpoint of the individual. They think to themselves, okay, well, if a girl doesn't like a guy, it's because the guy isn't making enough money, or spitting enough game, or tall or handsome or whatever enough, and the guy just needs to increase his kind of like sexual marketplace value. Is Rollo Tomasi kind of wrote about this concept, right? And I think obviously that's true. Obviously, women are more attracted to wealthier guys, or to better looking guys, or to more confident guys, whatever. But the kind of invisible element that they're not talking about is the society around relationships. And you can think of this very simply as social proof, right? You meet a girl, you're hanging out with a bunch of guys, all those guys clearly respect you, and they're all like competent, good looking guys as well, right? That's going to go a long way to signaling to that girl, like, hey, this isn't just some random guy who, could be good, could be bad, whatever. Like, he's got a friend group, he's got a social group. Like, in order to have those things, you have to be, you know, uh, sociable and, agreeable and have good relationships with people and all that kind of stuff, right? So there's that social proof, but it also goes deeper than that, right? Because if you think about a small town community and guy meets girl in the marketplace, for example, and they hit it off, they get each other's names, they go home, they're going to talk to their families, and those families are probably going to know the last name of the other family, right? And so they're going to they're going to be able to say, hey, this person has like a good reputation or a bad reputation, or, oh, I know, so and so's mother, we go to church together or whatever it is, right? And so there's all of these indirect ways in which this, romantic relationship that is, in the modern world, we see it through this lens of hyper individualism, which we'll get into a little bit shortly. But so just seeing it in that one-on-one way, but there's all of these ways with the community around these two people will support that. Will support, especially if the community thinks it's a good pairing, right? This is emergent phenomenon that comes out of a healthy community where it's kind of like the local deity is maybe a way to think about it, or just kind of like the good vibe of the community, whatever, however you want to conceptualize this. But a community can kind of be thought as an entity in of itself. And a good healthy community would want good pairings so that they can have good families and more kids and more prosperous community, all this kind of stuff. And so if people in a community see a good man and a good woman get together and hit it off, they're going to encourage that. And one of the problems that we have in the modern society is, man and a girl get into a fight, the girl goes back to her friends and her family, and they have this, it's the weird modern thing where they will just villainize the guy regardless, say, oh, he just must be a douchebag. He's probably a horrible guy. Like, it's so sad. You're absolutely in the right. And whereas in like the older, smaller communities, probably a pretty good chance that instead those people would be say like, hey, we know Johnny, and Johnny's a good guy, and I'm sure it was just a small thing, and we really want to see you guys together and happy, right? There's this intrinsic desire of a small, tight-knit community to keep relationships together, to keep people happy, to do all of that kind of stuff. And so, this is a very simple example of how, while we can talk academically about social structure and how how well do you know your neighbor, how often do you go events and all these kinds of things. We're often blind to all of these kind of indirect ways in which a healthy social structure actually benefits things like romantic relationships. And a lot of the times the conversation in the mainstream that we're having about things like romantic relationships, we're just looking at through the lens of the individual, where, if we kind of take that step back, we think about, okay, well, the collapse of social structures actually had a really negative effect on keeping relationships together. So the next section here, continuing on, is hyper-capitalism and its consequences. This is where I introduced the idea that we had these healthy, positive, natural social structures, and as society, kind of moved forward, and we had kind of outsourced work, we had larger institutions, especially across the country. We had pretty high trust, low crime, things were working out pretty well. People stopped caring about maintaining healthy social structure, or again, they didn't consciously understand what they had. And so they didn't realize when they started to optimize more for money than, the local social structure, that this was actually going to bite them in the foot. Right. My good friend, Skilos from the Cascadia group, he wrote an article not so long ago about how a lot of the evil in the world is effectively optimizing for short-term gain at the cost of long-term value. And a lot of times it's even a huge detriment to long-term value. And a lot of times that long-term value loss is hidden. And I agree, right? That's the fundamental idea to refuting techno-transhumanism. It's a fundamental idea here where the economic systems are short, easy, ways of achieving the material result that you're looking for, But all of these hidden structures that exist in the healthy social structure don't exist in the economic alternative. And a big part of why people did this was because, if you moved from a small town and you went to school in another, part of the state, or even another, part of the country, and then you moved for a job in one of the big cities, you could make a lot more money than you could at the small town, right? And people were pretty attracted to this, right? They wanted to pursue material wealth because they also didn't realize the trade-off, right? They didn't realize that leaving the small town would start to degrade the social structure of that small town. And enough people doing that would basically pull it apart to the point where it wasn't going to be able to maintain itself. And that's why, you kind of have the older, the silent generation, right? The boomers go off, they go to college, they start making all this money, they moving across the country. I mean, my folks did this too. They, out in California for a little while, and then they moved to the East Coast. But, and they were they've always been they were raised in the Northeast, but, obviously not in the towns that they grew up in. And myself as well. Like, I grew up in a small town in Connecticut. Went to school in Jersey, moved all over the country to kind of pursue the rowing career and different things. Ended up back in Connecticut, kind of close to the family, but now I'm in like northern Idaho, right? So it's you move around a lot. It's just kind of a accepted in the modern world. But again, it's impossible for my parents, if they wanted to pass off the social connections they have in the local community if I don't live in the local community, right? And so all of these things are breaking apart, they're breaking down, but we're not conscientious of this. We don't understand what we're giving up. If you ask people, it's very normal to say, oh yeah, I used to live here, my parents still live there in that part of the country, and I'll go home and visit them on holidays and whatnot. Like it's a very standard thing. I remember watching what was it, a Kurzgesagt video about how after you graduate from high school and you go to college, you've spent over like 90% of the time that you ever spent with your parents is already over, right? And part of the reason is people are not living around their folks. And that is a very big departure, very big change that I don't think is really well understood. So, I talk about this a little bit more. But again, it's these social structures. And so the example that I provide here is hospice care. So, hospice care, old folks care, right? Really effective economic alternative for people having to take care of their parents. It used to be the case where the older generation would just stay with the younger generation. Now, as long as the older generation has enough money, they can pay to have, to be taken care of by the economic alternative system. The problem with this is that, again, you're getting the same result on the face of things, right? The older generation is being taken care of, whether it's through the family or through money. Obviously, those things are not equal, right? This is one of the common classic mistakes that we see all throughout our modern society. We think, H-1Bs are just as good as, American citizen, engineers or workers or whatever. And so you make this false equivalency of, family taking care of older people is the same as, a random stranger in some, business that's trying to make a profit is going to take care of old people. I mean, we've all heard the horror stories, and I talk to people all the time who, tell me like, oh, I was just talking to one of my neighbors the other day about how her folks both of her folks are in old folks home, and one of the homes recently got a new person to take care of the food, right? A new company got the contract to take care of the food. Now the food's uneatable, inedible, right? And so you have this economic optimization that's taking the quality out of things. That's one one way of looking at it. But the other more important way of looking at it that I kind of highlight in the article here is, by moving to an economic alternative, you actually destroy a very healthy incentive in the system, which is probably one of the many reasons that we see kind of the disconnect the boomers have with the younger generations. And that is to say, if the older generation knew that the only way that they were going to be taken care of is by the younger generation, they are inherently incentivized to make sure the younger generation is successful, right? They would want their children to have good businesses, good incomes. They would ideally want happy, healthy families, right? They would want to see another generation, just in case, God forbid anyone, passes on prematurely or whatever, right? You want to have a big family around you when you're older, because they're going to take care of you, right? If you're just living by yourself, and this is kind of like the harsh and kind of terrifying reality for a lot of people who don't have kids, is, if you don't have kids, right, like, you're kind of dependent on the system, right? They're maybe you're lucky and you have, a sibling who has kids, and, maybe if you're, nice to them and all that kind of stuff, like, you'll still have, the younger generations of your extended family to be a part of. But, it's kind of terrifying to think how many people are going to be, kind of on their own and very, dependent on the system for that kind of help. But these invisible structures of a healthy society are really important, right? They're incentivizing the right behavior. And so by moving to these economic alternatives, and we can think about this from everything from daycare of children to education to things like therapy to intimacy, you think about like OnlyFans and all that kind of stuff, right? By outsourcing these to these economic alternatives, yeah, we're destroying healthy society in ways that we just do not understand. The next part of this is talking about hyper-individualism. And so one of the ways you can think about hyper-individualism, it is the lens through which most people in Western countries, most, Americans and Europeans see the world, right? We think of our lives as this kind of single player game where we are going to school so that we can learn about the best job that we can have. Then we go to, get a job, a nice career. We try to climb the corporate ladder so that we can afford a nice house and a nice car. And maybe we want a family as well. But it's all about personal achievement and advancement. It's only solely seen through that lens. There's nothing about, championing we have like vague ideas around like patriotism for the country and whatnot, but I think that it largely serves, to get us to buy into wars and other things like that. We're not really taught to have a pride in like our family name or our family heritage or the community that we lived in. We don't see our personal advancement as kind of as an opportunity to kind of take on more responsibility and make the world a better place for our children, right? It's very much seen through this lens of hyper individualism. And I think that this is really important to be aware of, because again, when people see the problems of our modern world and when they think about the solutions of our modern world, they're thinking exclusively through this lens of hyper individualism. They're looking at the dating problem and saying, I need to make more money, I need to be more attractive, and I need to do these things, instead of thinking, hey, I should build up a social group, because that is a really important part of having good romantic relationships. So understanding that is kind of a pervasive element. I also talk about what I call the John Wick fallacy, which we see this in modern culture all the time. John Wick has his dog that his recently passed wife had kind of given to him before she passed to cancer, and these mobsters killed the dog, and turns out he was the cleaner for a huge mob organization, and now that he's sufficiently motivated, he's going to go on this killing spree, and he's going to take out like the entire organization all on his own, right? And sure, it's a cool concept for a movie, and it's a power fantasy, and I get that. But also, what it kind of is trying to communicate to you is, well, if as an individual you can do you can take on large groups of people all on your own, right? Which is not the case, right? Strength comes from social networks. It comes from fraternal network and trust and collaboration. And if you're blind to that because of this hyper individualist mindset, where you're just focusing on personal gratification and success, at the individual level, and you're not thinking about, how can I not only make myself more successful, but how can I make my family more successful, right? My a family member, or family member just got married, and I'm talking to the guy, and trying to encourage him, like, hey, here's a way you can start a business. Here's a loan. Like, let's get you started, right? So the idea is that guy's going to take care of a member of my family, and hopefully they'll have some kids and I'll have some extended family, and so it benefits me, right, to try to set everyone in my family, my extended family, up for success around me. Um, and I think, we don't have that mindset, or at least a lot of Americans that I run into don't have this mindset of like, can we create a family dynasty, right? Can we get like, a bunch of people in the same family to own businesses in the same area and work collaboratively together? And, you can kind of push back on bad local government things, and make sure you're keeping the community a place where you want you and the rest of your family to grow up in, right? That mindset, that approach just doesn't exist, and I largely blame hyper individualism for it, and it's pervasive in all the content in the media, and kind of the story that we tell ourselves in America. This kind of pursuit of excellence and climbing the ladder, the corporate ladder. um, it's kind of this unspoken framework through how everything is sold to us, and we need to switch into what I call conscientious communitarianism, right? And that's the last step before we get into rebuilding social structure. It's basically a call for people to understand everything I've laid out earlier, that natural, healthy, in-person local social structure was superior because it balanced in all of these invisible ways. As we've moved towards these economic alternatives, we've actually lost a lot of these kind of invisible, healthy structures. And again, we didn't consciously understand what we had. We're only now realizing how bad things are getting. And if we have that awareness of why healthy social structure was good, not just in the this kind of like, oh, it's great to know your neighbors kind of like fluffy way. And I think that's a big part of the problem with this, is when we're talking about it online, it has to be very soundbitey. It has to be very kind of low resolution. We don't get to have the long form conversation. And so people don't really understand kind of the many, many ways that healthy social structure, all of these invisible, less thought of kind of dimensions in which healthy community balances things out and incentivizes good cooperative behavior. And I think that if we are to rebuild something, again, going back to that point that Skilios makes about good and evil and progress, we have to be incentivized and thinking about the long-term value, right? We need to be able to give up the short-term gain in order to build something that is going to pay off in the long run. And that is much easier to do if you don't have to convince everyone around you to do that. It's if you have people who are already on the wavelength of, I understand that if I want my kids to have a chance at success, they need to be part of a healthy community. I know I need to sacrifice to make that happen, and so that means I need to be conscientiously building healthy, strong communities and fraternities. It's much easier to build a positive parallel movement out of that, as opposed to spending all this time getting people on board. And so that mindset of conscientious communitarianism is something that I see as pretty fundamental, pretty important to advocate for. But again, giving that a term, right, conveying to people this is something that's important. I think that in and of itself starts to get people to think about it and to focus on it, right? It's like casting spells. We get into all that kind of fun stuff. All right. So the second half of the article is on rebuilding social structure. So we understand natural social structure was good. Economic alternatives replaced that. We lost a lot of these healthy, invisible systems. We need to get back to rebuilding social structure. But a big part of this is we need to do it in a way that is practical. I see a lot of people who, range of different efforts that are roughly in this direction of parallel movement, but they make a lot of mistakes, a lot of pretty bad, pretty prohibitive mistakes. And so the goal of this second half is to kind of lay out what are the common issues, what are the solutions that I would advocate for, what are kind of the elements of the right solutions. I want to talk third about branding, and how to kind of advocate for these things. And then lastly, I want to talk about actual strategies that you could put into action. So the first issue, the first couple of issues. So we're talking about the issues around planning. The first one is this hang up that we get on there's only one right solution. I do think that there's probably a best solution or an optimal solution in kind of a vacuum. But also we have to kind of understand that everyone has a different context, a different situation, a different set of skills and abilities and proclivities that they have, right? This is the common mistake between objective truth and subjective truth. It's not that there is, everything is subjective and nothing is true. It's no, everything is objective, but at the individual level, what is best for you is dependent on the environment around you. It's subjectively objective, or whatever you want to say there. So in that sense, there is no one right solution. I would also argue that a big part of this too is this is a battle on multiple fronts, right? We need people who want to take over academia. We want people who are going to take over the economic business side. We want people who, I have friends like Yukimaru who are vehemently opposed to advocating in any way for subsistence farming, right? And I totally get that, right? I think if you have really smart, driven people who have the potential to build great online networks and do a bunch of cool stuff like that, that is a multiplier and should not be ignored. That being said, I like that there's subsistence farming kind of people there. Right? I think that there's people where that's going to be appealing to them. That's the domain that they're happy in. That's what they're good at. Maybe they're in a place where they want to stay close to their family and their family's done farming for a long time and it's just kind of the thing that they can do. I mean, we also need to eat healthy and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's kind of a mistake to get caught up on saying, well, there's one right solution and anyone who's not following this or with me on that is, my enemy or, I can't work with. So the other mistake or common issue around planning is unnecessarily exclusive. So, and I think about this from the concept of like understanding, right? Again, we have this problem in the counterculture space where people kind of purity test each other by, well, how much do you really understand about like what's going wrong in the world today, and how bad, I don't know, rainbow Christianity is, or you'll have people who are like, yeah, if you're not a Christian or if you're a pagan, or if do you believe in like flat Earth or the moon landing or 9/11 or whatever, right? It's just a bunch of that kind of stuff. It's like, this does not matter. Right. What matters in the rebuilding of social structure is people who are committed to rebuilding social structure. And certainly, I think that there is value in being exclusive on a lot of different dimensions, quality being one of them, authenticity being another. But being exclusive when it is not necessary, on dimensions that aren't necessary, is really counterproductive. And I see this all the time. So trying to avoid that when it comes to planning. The last piece here is this failure to launch, that people get caught in these perpetual arguments about, what is the right thing or whatever. And they're just kind of sitting around doing nothing, just talking about it. They never actually put it into practice. Oh, almost Freudian slip there, said praxis. Man, those guys, just a heads up, those guys have not done much. That is definitely a failure to launch situation. But the point that I'm making here is my strategies for networking across the counterculture space have largely been focused on finding people who are already doing something. Why is that? Well, because action is the most pure form of belief, and action is it's the greatest test, right? It's like, are you willing to do the hard work that is unglamorous, that is unnoteworthy, that just is actually moving the needle locally, right? Because there's so many people who what they care about is notoriety and being part of these LARPy online power fantasies. And so they will optimize in that direction, which means no action, no actual action. It just means being terminally online and trying to Machiavellianly work your way up the power systems and stuff like that. So when it comes to planning, failure to launch is a big thing. We'll talk about solutions and strategies and whatnot, and that this idea of action will come back up. But I care much more about getting people to do things than I do what they do specifically. And I also think that if you get people to try and to do things and to go out there, they're going to find out, one, it's not nearly as intimidating or difficult as they thought, insurmountable. There's definitely difficulties, and there's going to be unforeseen difficulties, that they'll run into. But then also they're going to learn, they're going to move towards more practical solutions. And so the idea is, if you keep trying, you might fail a bit, but you're going to find your way towards something that works. Solutions. So talking about okay, yeah. So I kind of went through the issues, and then I also have the solutions here. I kind of forgot how I structured this, but these are just kind of echoing the three issues of only one right solution, unnecessary exclusivity, and failure to launch. So the solutions in order is, well, there's multiple dimensions of solutions, kind of what I was saying earlier. The master of both worlds for being unnecessarily exclusive. So the idea there is to say, hey, look, you can have friends who are local, who don't get all of the things or whatever, but they're volunteering in their local community groups, and they're just pleasant, good people to be around. Like you don't need those people to get it, or whatever. Those are still going to be good people, and so kind of exist. You can have your kind of more exclusive group of guys who you're really tight with, and then you could just be. I think of it as kind of low effort connections, right? You could just be a friendly, good, reasonable, nice person to other people who are, through their actions, proving that they care about community building. I don't think that is there's no reason, again, to be exclusionary in that way. And then the last point here is that action over theory, right? That the failure to launch is because people are worrying too much about the perfect, and it's getting in the way of actually getting something done. And so I would just say, actually go out there, do stuff. Again, this is the best indicator of someone's true conviction and worth. And you'll figure it out as you go. Branding. So common issues with branding, edgy aesthetics. I mean, this is something that I've been hammering on a little bit more recently. I think that all of the 1930s German army LARPing stuff is really counterproductive. You are not actually a National Socialist, or a German National Socialist or whatever, right? You are an American who is pissed off with the corruption in the system and wants to reclaim America for Americans. And by leaning into that aesthetic, you create a situation where it makes it very hard for you to work with people in your local community. That's not to say, and interestingly enough, I had a long form podcast with Kulak like a week or two ago, and I put that out. And one of the points that Kulak makes is you don't have to disavow, people who, maybe on the conservative side, or they're, getting close to like the fascistic side or whatever. You don't have to disavow them. The left never does this with, even insane violence on the left. You see that all the time, and the politicians will just duck and dive the question. And so, like, I'm not disavowing edgy aesthetics, but I am aggressively warning against it, especially for the more intellectual vanguard, out there. I think, again, the best path that you can have is to move towards working collaboratively in your community. And you're not going to be able to do that if you are immersing yourself in edgy aesthetics. Intentionally exclusive jargon is the other piece with the common issues with branding. Again, using language that kind of pushes people away from your spirit. They don't know what you're talking about. Or again, it's kind of spicy branding. And the way that I would say this is, for as far as solutions, is focusing on the universal, right? Understanding that what we are striving for, at least what I believe I'm striving for, and I think that the people who are well aligned are striving for, is, again, taking back America for America, such that we can have, children and healthy families and raise those kids up to be happy, well oriented, to set them up for future success. We want the next generation to be more successful than we are, right? That, I think, that is something that we should all aspire to. It's not really like a questionable stance. And this is something that if you go out into the world today and you talk to people in your local community, and you're talking about like, hey, I care about community, I care about family, and I care about fraternity, and I care about the safety in my community. I want people to be economically successful. Like, these are things that are universally appealing. They're not hard. Everyone is oriented towards that. The other piece too is we should be creating something that's uniquely American. As I said earlier, you aren't any of these spicy aesthetic things. You're just an American who wants, to see a healthy America. And I think that whatever is actually going to be successful, whatever actually is going to lead the way, it needs to be grounded in Americanism, right? It needs to be grounded in our ethos. You look at the American First movement, and I think this is a perfect example of that, right? It's not trying to be anything else. It's trying to be American and deal with the current issues of our time. It's why it's successful. The old LARPy bullshitty, return, be a barbarian, or this, that, or the other thing, it's not going to work. It's not American. And so if we're going to be successful, we have to create something that is uniquely American. Finally, when we're talking about issues and solutions, we're talking about building. The first problem when it comes to building is people get over ambitious. And there's a few reasons for this, right? A lot of people feel very pressured to get something done quickly. They're like, oh, the world's ending, economic collapse is just around the corner, blah, 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 blah. We need to, immediately start the fallback, civilization and, all this kind of stuff. It's like, no, that trying to go too big, too quick is guaranteed failure. So being smart about approaching this practically is a very important part of building and being successful in building. The second piece is over prioritization of achievements. And so what I mean by that is a lot of times when groups are being built, they are judging their own success by metrics that aren't actually indicators of success. So they'll say like, how many people do we have, right? Or how big an event can we run, or, how big a town can we build, or something like that. And it's like, cool. Yeah. Those might be indicators of success, achievements, but what really matters is group cohesion, right? It's people who trust each other and will work together. Because if you build something, right, if your group goes out and runs an event or builds a community or whatever, and then immediately falls apart after, well, it didn't really matter what you accomplished, right? Because you destroyed the social structure to do it. And so the correct answer to the over prioritization of achievements is that you're focusing on the wrong metrics. And the metric that you have to think about, that you should focus on, is group cohesion. So getting into the solutions, the kind of the first thing in the response to the over ambitiousness is practical means small, local, and long term. So that means start small, start in the area around you, and then think long term. Give yourself a long kind of runway to approach these things. And again, this is practical. If you can't get 3 or 4 guys together for a barbecue in your local community, how are you ever going to start like a new town out in the woods and get a bunch of people to build houses for each other or whatever, right? You have to start small, and you have to think long term, because and I highlighted here, solutions are meaningless if they are not practical, right? And so kind of starting small and then building that trust, building that cohesion, that's such a big part of this. And the interesting thing is you don't have to do a lot of big, grandiose, large scale stuff to build cohesion. Just getting a few guys together, to go camping on a weekend, that builds cohesion. That builds trust. You get to see, did people show up on time? Did they bring the stuff that they need? Right? If it starts raining, are they going to like wuss out and, complain, or are they going to, find solutions and figure things out? You learn a lot about people, right? It's the same idea of like kids playing, right? The reason that they play is as a proxy for real interaction. And if people aren't, following the rules of the game, you're like, well, I'm probably not going to want to like build a business with you or whatever. And so even these small things, they'll build trust, they'll build cohesion, you'll get to know people, and that's much easier to then scale up over time. I kind of jumped the goat there a little bit. That one's trust through shared experience, which is something that I go into later. The other piece is group cohesion over achievements, what I talked about earlier when it came to over prioritization of achievements. It's you got to put the metric of success for a social structure is not what is achieved, but the cohesion of the group itself. And then the last kind of answer or solution to proper building is prioritizing quality over quantity. That should be over. For those watching the video, you can see I had of instead of over, but I kind of I got this out, and then I don't think I did a read through after writing it, but the structure was just so good, and I'd finally, it was just like I wanted to get it out. So, but prioritizing quality over quantity, and the idea there is to say, and I see this all the time. This is an example that I give a lot where, I'll run a group chat and I'll have a bunch of people, and then there's someone who's really active in the group chat. They're posting stuff, they're talking constantly, they're replying to everyone, and when I first started running group chats, I was like, great, I have interaction and I want to cultivate more people who are, active and involved and passionate and all of this kind of stuff. What you quickly realize is, especially if you have good quality people, they value their time. They don't want to have like meaningless interactions. They don't want people reposting stuff from the timeline. It's like we all have our own timeline. Like if there's a big thing that comes up and you want to post it in the group chat and share kind of a take on it, and that sparks the conversation, that's one thing. But if you're just like, hey, like thing I saw, right? People are like, yeah, cool. I mean, we've all seen that. We don't need to be reminded of it. It's kind of more noise than signal. And so you might be hesitant to kind of kick these people from group chats, or what I try to do is just kind of talk to them and be like, hey, try to keep the, the quality, the interactions to quality stuff only, or whatever it is. But people are hesitant because, again, they think of this interaction as a quantity they want to encourage more of, but they are not realizing, no, what you want is quality. And a lot of times when you kick people who are kind of, crunching the vibe or whatever you want to say, you'll actually have a lot of good quality people fill that silence with much more quality observations, right? People don't want to interact when it's just a bad quality conversation. But as soon as you get rid of the people who are kind of taking over the conversation and saying a bunch of dumb shit, all of the more intelligent, more interesting people feel a lot more comfortable to contribute and involve themselves. And so this is very much the same for just building a group broadly. If you have a bunch of people, but a lot of them are kind of idiots or, annoying, or they're really into the edgy aesthetics or whatever it is, good quality people don't want those people around. And so if you need to be prioritizing quality right from the beginning. Do not mistake quantity as the, again, metric that you want to optimize for. All right. So that was the problems and solutions of planning, branding, and building. Hopefully you're able to kind of take something away from that. Again, these are meant to point out common problems that people run into and just good things to be thinking about when building. This is for both people joining social groups, but also trying to build social groups. The last bit here is talking about actionable strategies. And so there's 5 actionable strategies. It's find fraternal networks, join local volunteer groups, start or organize or find work parties, become the guy, and then meet your mutuals. And so we'll go into each one of these in more depth. The first one, find fraternal networks, and maybe I should have included online networks. Ideally, that's the easiest place to start. I run my own online network. There's plenty of other groups that are running online networks. Obviously, you have to be someone of quality who they're going to want, but it's a lot easier to find these networks than you think. You find a content creator who you like their stuff, almost guaranteed that they have a group chat, and they might have like an exclusive cool kids, people they trust group chat, but they also probably have like a friends of the podcast group chat. And that's a great way to get involved. You also have things like the OGC or the Weavers, or there's a lot of other groups. And so it's very easy to find online groups that you can become a part of. I guess I'll also kind of lump in the Meet Your Mutuals. I'll jump. That was at the end here, but similar vein of just reach out to people. If there's people on the timeline that you're having good conversations with, or you're seeing good comments from, or they put out good posts, you shouldn't be hesitant to hit them up in DMs, especially if they've mutualed you, right? If you follow them and they follow you back, just say like, hey, like your content, love to jump on a call sometime. X has a pretty cool feature where you can call people from your account to their X account. So you don't even have to give Telegram or phone number or Signal or any of those kinds of things away. And yeah, you just have a conversation. Just be like, hey, like your stuff. Here's why, yada, yada, appreciate what you're doing. And you'll find like, you'll either hit it off or you won't. But the phone call, it's or however you want to do it, just DMing back and forth, sending voice messages, whatever the vibe is, that you want to cultivate. But meeting your mutuals, I've met tons of people offline, in person, we'll go grab coffee, grab a drink. I'll be passing through their area or something like that. And really haven't had bad interactions. There's obviously I have some people from the BAP sphere, from the dissident right leadership, who I am very much no longer friends with, and met some of those guys in person. But you have to be willing to take risks to do that. And honestly, the fallout hasn't really been that bad. Maybe I'm in kind of a lucky position, and maybe you find people and you can play it, close to the vest. I think OPSEC is a personal decision, and no one should ever fault anyone for wanting to remain however anonymous they want to remain, as they're kind of building relationships and joining networks and stuff like that. But I will say that I think a lot of the concern around those things is extremely overhyped, especially for kind of smaller accounts. And you should not hesitate to reach out, find these networks, to meet your mutuals. The other piece here is join local volunteer groups. Again, we are trying to sort for people who care about community and family and fraternity. And local volunteer groups people have self-selected into those groups because they care about those things. They have to take action by necessity. They are doing stuff. And so local volunteer groups are a great thing to participate in and to find like-minded people. And again, they might be people who don't really get all the things, so to speak, or are, when they go to the ballot box, they're going to vote something very different than you. But how much does that really matter when, they're actively involved in your community? I would take someone who is volunteering at the fire department, a local search and rescue, or a parent who's involved in the PTA because they care about the education of their kids, over someone who's just online, part of these LARP power fantasies, who aren't really doing anything. The people who are active, they're far more important to know, because they're actually going to have the local effect. And so it's worth your time, energy, and effort to get involved. You're going to meet some really good quality people. I found that volunteering at like the local search and rescue, I met people who ran businesses across the area, who had families who had been there for a really long time. You just immediately are connected in with this really high quality group of people. And so joining local volunteer groups, you just search online, find some, show up, introduce yourself, talk to people. Again, with the branding side of things, just be like, hey, look, I care about local community. I want to be involved. I think this stuff is important. I think we got to support each other. You could even be like, hey, look, I think the modern world is becoming, very isolated, and, social media and blah, blah, blah. People who are showing up at local volunteer groups will get that, right? Regardless of politics, they will agree with you when you say, everyone's too online and too detached, and, we need to rebuild community. They're going to love that you're someone who's on that wavelength. So join the local volunteer groups, show up, test it out. If you don't like it, you can go find another one. It's not a big deal. Work parties is another option. So work parties is a concept that I've gotten picked up locally here from the PNW crowd. And I love it as a concept. Chicken coop nationalism, as we jokingly say. And the idea is to say, get a bunch of guys together over a weekend, or just even be a single day. It doesn't matter, and work together on a project, right? So somebody needs some fence put up on their place. They want to build a chicken coop so they can keep some chickens. They have to put some drywall up. They're renovating their business. They gotta just move some stuff. Whatever somebody's moving, right? Like that's kind of that's a very like mainstream thing of like, do you have friends you could call who'd help you move, right? So there's a lot of truth to that. People who are, again, it's that action is the highest signal of quality. People who are going to show up, who are going to help you out. That says a lot right away. And it doesn't have, again, it's not a big flashy thing. You're not building a community out in the middle of the woods. You're not doing anything crazy or super over. You're just showing up to help each other out with fencing. Or you could be something if you just got a bunch of people who have live in apartments in an area next to each other. They don't really have anything to work on. Maybe let's say instead of just going out and having a beer or whatever, you go to a local park and just bring a bunch of trash bags and pick up some trash and clean it up. I know it's super cliche, super boring, doesn't seem like a big impact, but again, it's not about what you're achieving. And then that is definitely a productive thing to achieve regardless. It's about the cohesion that you're building between the people, right? And if you're say that's the thing, every other weekend you're showing up and you guys go to a different part of the town and you're picking up trash. Well, the people who stick with it, right, they're going to be worth knowing. Those are the people who are putting the time, energy, and effort, right? So work parties is a really, really great way to build relationships. It's a great way to get a sense of who's really, got the conviction and the drive and the belief to put these things into practice. And what you'll find too is that quality of people then becomes a group who maybe you start something bigger. Maybe you start a local business. Maybe you realize there's an opportunity there. Maybe you get involved in a certain, local volunteer group or whatever, right? That becomes that consolidation of a few guys becomes like a stronger cohesive node that could either attach to other strong cohesive nodes or become a hub in and of itself, right? So there's a lot of value to work parties, and I highly recommend. And all you have to do is find some local guys. You'd be like friends from high school or guys you go to the local gym with or whatever, and just be like, yo, and have conversations you have a fence problem or whatever, your fence broke, we should get a few guys, just see if we can come over. And the person who's getting the work done, maybe they buy beer, or grill up some burgers or something like that for all the other guys. It's very easy stuff, and it's really good. So the last one, because we did meet your mutuals earlier, the last one here is to become the guy, right? And I'll write a more in-depth article on becoming the guy later. And I am doing a lecture series with Moritz and the Minuteman group on becoming the guy. And a lot of the content that I'm talking about here is going to be in that. But the fundamental idea behind becoming the guy, and this dovetails really nicely with my own academic background working on it's called network sociology. And there's this researcher at the University of Columbia called Duncan Watts, really interesting guy, wrote a lot of good papers. The paper that he wrote on the strength of weak ties, effectively, is the most cited academic paper by 3x. And we're including Einstein's relativity and all of the other, big things that you've heard of, right? This is the most cited paper of all time in all of academia. And the insight that Watts and his colleagues came up with was weak ties that kind of bridge gaps in the network, right? And if you just looked at networks through geographical proximity, for example, and messages had to move from person to person in kind of a geographical line, our networks would take forever to move across. But it's the fact that we have these kind of long, weak ties, right? It's I know someone on the West Coast. And so if you had to get a message to someone on the West Coast, and you didn't know anyone, well, I do, and I'm going to send it to that person. And that person's going to think, okay, this person's a lawyer or something like that in a certain area. Well, I know a lawyer who's in that area, and they send the message on to them. And then that person probably, maybe they know the guy the lawyer guy who knows all the other lawyer guys, and they send it to him, and then he's like, oh yeah, I know Johnny, and send it, and then that's your 5 degrees of separation right there. But it's because you're kind of moving through these different dimensions of the network that you can bridge, long geographical distances or long professional distances very quickly. And so, but the point is, you want to find these hubs, right? These hyper connectors who have all of these relationships that are bridging across different social groups, because those people, because they can facilitate the trade between all of those different groups, they become very powerful, right? They're the connection hub, right? The guy is the person in your community who everyone seems to know or know of. They're very helpful. They're willing to, lend a hand. But most importantly, they know the people who, if you need a mechanic or a doctor or legal advice or help with your taxes or whatever, or help with not paying your taxes, you can find the guy, right? And the guy will point you in the right direction. And so I think that if we, again, in service of this rebuilding of social structure, and we're trying to encourage people, to do things that are going to help build social structure, becoming the guy is one of the things that you can do. And again, it shouldn't take a lot of effort. You're going out to these local volunteer groups, you're getting to know people, you're, active in your community. One of the things that I try to do when if I need to get my car fixed or I need to get a haircut or whatever it is I'll ask my friends, hey, where's the local barber? Who's your guy that you go to? And usually, sometimes people are just like, I got a Supercuts or whatever. But there's usually someone, and that's the case up here in Northern Idaho, that was like, oh, there's a great spot. You have to go to that spot. That guy's great. Tell him I sent you, yada, yada. Right. And you meet that guy, you talk to that guy, and you build a relationship with that guy. You put his number in your phone, you give him your number, and you say, hey, I would, and you pay in cash. Right. Like you build that relationship. And the idea is, down the line, if someone asks you, hey, where's the barber? You send him to that guy. Right. And now you're building a relationship. The barber knows that you're going to help encourage other people to go there. He's going to be nice to you. Right. Maybe you have a conversation at some point. The barber mentions like, oh, I know you're in, tech sales, like, they've met this other guy and he's in tech sales. You guys should chat. Right. And that's how you build relationships. So becoming the guy, it's an aspiration that doesn't really take a lot of extra effort. You get to know people in your community. You can point people in the right direction. It really is just a matter of taking on the responsibility of going that very small little extra step of building relationships with people and getting to know them. And you learn tricks. Like, I've been networking for a long time, and anytime I meet someone new, I'll put their first name and, maybe their last name, but I always make a point of saying, Johnny the barber, or, Johnny the guy who makes mead, in the local community. And, it's like that way they're easily searchable. You kind of, you have a strategy for knowing, reaching out to them. Christmas rolls around, you should go through your whole extended Rolodex and just send everyone like a happy Christmas or, happy New Year or whatever. Right. Stuff like this. It's like writing Christmas cards like back in the day. Right. All of this stuff matters. And we've just really lost the ability to do it, or the understanding that we should be doing it. Right. That conscientious communitarianism stuff. But I think it's a lot easier than people think. So that is the full article. I've gone top to bottom. We're about an hour and 15 minutes in. So we've done a good amount of time here. But I'll simply say, to kind of summarize, again, we have this problem where many of the problems that we see in society, that we see in our own personal lives, that we see in the government or any of these other places, largely can be traced back to the destruction of social structure. It's the replacement with these economic alternatives. It's funny. I advocate for, some sort of feudalism. I think we're going to go there. I think we're going to have a more of a splintering thing. I've had this conversation a few times more recently now. And part of the reason for that is because I think a feudalistic structure incentivizes leaders to take care of their people, right? If you have these smaller, feudal states where, you have, someone leading an enclave of people. Well, that person is only as powerful as like the people and the resources that they have in their little feudalistic domain. And so they're very incentivized to make sure that they're taking care of the people at that level. Right now in society, a lot of these big corporations, they know, or at least they perceive people to be interchangeable. And so they can treat people poorly. They can fire them after, years of service, or whatever it is, and they're not going to have any blowback, right? Other people are still going to join up knowing that, they treated the guy before them pretty horribly because, there's so few options, and because quality isn't really appreciated um, as much as it should be. But again, if you move to these different structures, these feudalistic kind of inspired structures, that incentivization system changes in a really healthy way that's good for people. And so I hope we move there. I think it is a superior structure. But again, it's about conscientious communitarianism. It's about understanding how these healthy natural social structures were actually really effective in balancing things out. We talked about hospice care and how that's kind of taking away the incentivization for the older generation to care more about the success of the younger generation. We talked about how the lack of social structure makes it far more difficult to have romantic relationships because women would usually pick up a lot of their judgment of the quality of a man by the company he kept and the people in the area. They're kind of encouraging her to, that is a good pairing. The other piece with that, I didn't even mention this before, but I think one of the problems that we have with women, cheating or having issues with that is largely because most men in society either don't know or don't care when a woman's in a relationship. They'll still hit on her. They'll still signal their attraction or whatever it is. And that is very confusing for a woman because if you're in a small community and a woman got that, received a man's interest, even though people in the community knew that she was with someone, the inherent signal there is that there is no respect for her husband, for her mate. And so, it's fair to kind of interpret that as like, oh, well, the guy who's showing interest is of higher quality, right? Because if she had a good quality guy, the other guys would fear trying to hit on her because, they realize, well, I mean, they want the good social structure and the good family to maintain, but they also know that like people in the community, right? That's a very fast way to generate a very bad reputation is if you sleep with another guy's wife or something like that, right? And so if you value the community, if you don't really have a lot of options out of necessity, you're going to treat other people's wives in kind of a respectful and platonic manner. We just don't have that today, right? Because we don't have the cohesion, the close knit small town community, vibes that matter with reputation. Or people can do a scummy thing and then just move on to a different group, a different neighborhood, a different part of the country, and continue to get away with it. And so a lot of ways that this breakdown of social structure is actually, contributing to a lot of the problems today. But because we have this mindset of hyper individualism, we're not understanding them, in the complex and comprehensive way that we should be. And in order for us to get back, in order for us to be successful, we need to have this conscientious communitarianism. Again, in order to rebuild, there's a lot of issues and solutions. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail as kind of a recap, but as far as planning, it's really about being practical and getting things done and not being over exclusionary. For branding, it's avoid edgy aesthetics and focus on more universal jargon that's uniquely American. For building, it's not being overambitious and not prioritizing the incorrect things. Start local, start small, think long term, work your way up. Those things will build the group cohesion, which is the most important thing. And you'll build that trust through shared experience. Trust is the foundation. That is the thing that you should be really trying to optimize towards and really put quality over quantity. And if you do those things, I think things will fall into place. But yeah, so that's it for the live stream on the necessity of rebuilding social structure. I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope that if you were just listening, all of this kind of laid out in a good way. And I encourage you, if you're interested in this stuff, part of writing this was such that people could just have the strategy, go out and apply this in their own lives. But also another part of this is to say, putting this out. One of the ways that I think about like signaling and signaling quality is putting stuff like this out and saying, this is what we care about. And we care about it enough to define it at this intricate level. And whenever I'm, as a recruiter, if I'm judging the quality of someone's ability, in their, professional domain, like whether it's marketing or software or whatever, one of the biggest ways that I judge that is to say, okay, what are the common problems that you run into in your domain, and how do you solve that? Because that shows experience. It shows, okay, I've done actual things before. I've run into the common problems enough that I can categorize what problems they are. I've figured out how to successfully solve those problems, and so I can preemptively avoid them to begin with, right? So with this thing is like, if you're focusing on building something too big too quick, and you read this and you realize, oh, we should start small, right? You have to go through the pain of building something too quick, having that fall apart, having that sour relationships, and do all of this kind of stuff. And so I like to think that writing something like this is a signal to those who don't want to waste their time, who want to be part of a group that's serious and thoughtful and intentional with how they approach building fraternal networks, who understand the value of these fraternal networks. Again, another big part of this is just articulating the unsaid things, right? We might agree that fraternal networks are important. Why are they important? Oh, well, they balance things on all these kind of invisible levels, and reputation is a really necessary part of that. And so once people can give that a term or a word or a concept, it becomes a lot easier to focus on and to be conscientious of, and respect in the right way, and be successful in building these things out. And so I hope that going through this with me, and hopefully there was something that you took out of it. But also, if you're interested in stuff like that, do feel free to reach out. I am relaunching my website. We're going on it. I like to think that it looks really nice, really clean, really exciting, and I am looking forward to bringing more people into the meta network. I think we've got a lot of good, exciting stuff coming down the pipe. We've got a lot of these kind of exclusive retreats that we're going to do, and facilitating more in-person socialization, strong relationship building, get more active, kind of seeding these work parties. We've got a bunch of other projects, so it's a very exciting time. I have a lot of conversations with people one-on-one. I'm starting to talk to a lot of really high quality individuals who've kind of been lurking, and they largely agree with what they see in the counterculture space, but they're very turned off by, again, the edgy aesthetics. They're turned off by the lack of kind of professionalism and intentionality, and they like to see these kinds of things, because to them, it's like, all right, how do you know something's worth investing in, right? And it's kind of going beyond just kind of the online back and forth stuff, and saying all the things that we already kind of talking about the problems we already agree on, talking about solutions and being able to articulate them in a comprehensive way. That, again, action and quality of thought and maturity are things that I'm looking for. And because I'm putting out content of that focus, I'm finding a lot of people who are also on that wavelength. And so it's a very exciting time. I hope you'll join us. And just remember, it was never over, and we have never been more back. We'll catch you in the next one.